Chapter 4. Eliminating Small Businesses. Only in America could penniless immigrants become affluent by starting their own businesses. Today, our aggression keeps the disadvantaged from following in their footsteps. The marketplace ecosystem. Honoring our neighbor's choice. In the previous chapter, we learned how enlightened employers paid higher wages, attracted the best workers, and were rewarded with the positive feedback of profit. Blacks who felt that no employer paid what they were worth often had the option of going into business for themselves as printers, plumbers, carpenters, or stonecutters. Frequently, blacks found this latter route was the most rapid way to affluence. Many immigrants discovered the same thing. The natural balance of the marketplace ecosystem also determined whether or not new ventures would stay in business. Business people who pleased their customers with better service and/or low prices got referrals and repeat business. Profit was a direct reflection of how they served their neighbors. If they charged their customers excessively, other entrepreneurs began providing the product at a lower price, voluntarily accepting less profit to attract more customers, and ultimately more profit. Greedy competitors lost customers. Profit and loss gave the tradespeople feedback and told them when they were, and were not, serving others adequately. Service providers reaped as they sowed. The customers voted daily with their purchasing dollars to supply this feedback. They directly regulated the marketplace ecosystem, keeping it in balance without aggression. The customer was the final authority. The customer was king. If our fictitious neighbor George thought his employer was exploiting him, George might decide to create wealth by going into business for himself. We'd never dream of stopping George at gunpoint from providing service to willing customers because he hadn't gotten our permission to do so. The business that George and his customers voluntarily agree to transact is up to them. We simply honor our neighbor's choice. We know that trying to tell George, at gunpoint, what he can do and cannot do is likely to destroy any feelings of concern and trust that George may have for us. Brotherly love seems to dissolve when looking down a gun barrel. Of course, if we start it, George will probably fight back. Perhaps he'll call the local sheriff and have us arrested. Perhaps he'll retaliate with sufficient force to make us unlikely or unable to threaten him again. Starting it is a prescription for warfare, whether we're adults or children. If we prevent George from creating wealth for himself, how would he survive? Chances are that he would feel justified in stealing the wealth we create, perpetuating the conflict between us. Just as our interference with George and his willing customers would wreak havoc with our neighborhood, so would the same actions create animosity and beget poverty in our city, state, and nation. Aggression disrupts the marketplace ecosystem. Some whites were well aware that as long as the marketplace ecosystem was free from aggression, blacks, immigrants, and other minorities would have the opportunity to better themselves. Therefore, they clamored, successfully, for us to condone the aggression of licensing laws to destroy the small minority businesses. Licensing laws instructed the government enforcement agents to stop, at gunpoint if necessary, individuals from providing a service to a willing customer unless they have permission from a licensing board. By requiring high license fees, written examinations for manual occupations, and excessive schooling or apprenticeships, licensing boards were able to exclude blacks and other disadvantaged minorities. Blacks were almost entirely forced from the trades, even the specialties in which they had been well represented. U.S. citizenship was frequently required to exclude new immigrants as well. While minimum wage laws prevented the disadvantaged from getting that first job, licensing laws prevented them from starting their own businesses. Prevented from being an employer or an employee, disadvantaged individuals frequently found themselves unable to legally create wealth for themselves and their loved ones. In New York City, for example, would-be taxi drivers must purchase a medallion or a license before they can legally carry customers. The number of medallions is limited and has not been increased since 1937. A new driver must purchase a medallion from someone who is retiring. In 1986, these medallions were selling for more than $100,000. Many people who have a car and would be capable of creating wealth for themselves and their loved ones are forbidden, by law, to do so because they can't afford the medallion. Those who are prosperous enough to purchase one must charge their customers more to make up for the extra expense. Thus, the first requirement for a successful cab driver in New York City is not pleasing the customer. Having money or the ability to borrow it is more important. Customers are no longer king. The poor get poorer. Discrimination against the disadvantaged. The licensing laws prohibit the disadvantaged from creating wealth by providing cab service even if they have a car, are capable drivers, and have willing customers. Most of the licensed taxi drivers can make a good living servicing only the better parts of the city. Few venture into the ghetto areas. Consequently, when those too poor to afford a car need to go to the doctor, legal taxi service is usually unavailable. Fortunately, residents able to purchase their own vehicle eventually decided that they would offer such service illegally. By 1979, these gypsy operatives were believed to be more numerous than the number of medallion holders. As long as they stayed in the ghetto areas, the government enforcement agents looked the other way. When the gypsy cabs came into the better areas, however, medallion holders insisted that the government enforcement agents prevent the gypsy drivers from servicing customers, at gunpoint if necessary. We can learn several important lessons from the New York experience. First, the gypsy drivers were almost exclusively minorities, mostly black and Puerto Rican, yet they were able to create a substantial amount of wealth, even in their impoverished areas, by providing a desperately needed service. When we don't interfere with the marketplace ecosystem, even the ghetto residents are able to create a significant amount of wealth. Second, the licensing requirements excluded the disadvantaged from creating wealth in the better areas of town where more profit was possible. The aggression of licensing laws simply made the rich richer and the poor poorer. Because many of the poor were minorities, these licensing laws were, in fact, discriminatory. Finally, the customers suffered as well. In the better areas of the city, they paid more for taxi service, because the licensing laws increased the cost of doing business and limited the number of drivers to select from. The would-be customers in the ghetto frequently had no service at all. Other examples. The interstate trucking industry is regulated in much the same way as the New York City taxis. The primary criterion for permission to create wealth by moving goods across state lines is the ability to afford the license required by the Interstate Commerce Commission. Voluntary transactions between the trucker and the customer are forbidden, by law, without such approval. Needless to say, minorities and the disadvantaged are underrepresented in the trucking industry because of these restrictions. Licensing laws dealing with daycare have severely impaired the ability of women with young families to create wealth. As mothers enter the workforce, they select a child care provider that best suits their standards and their pocketbook. Mothers who have no other marketable skills can create wealth by caring for the children of working mothers. Unfortunately for everyone, these natural child care providers are often forbidden by law from providing this service because they cannot afford to remodel their homes to meet licensing restrictions, pay for licensing fees, or deal effectively with the red tape required to get government permission to provide daycare. We've supported this aggression to protect young children from unsafe and unscrupulous daycare providers. Obviously, most parents are better equipped than anyone else to evaluate the quality of care their child receives. Parents who are not competent or interested enough in their child's care to do so usually pose a much greater threat to their children than a sloppy daycare operator could. Our efforts are redundant at best. At worst, licensing laws harm the very people they are meant to help. Licenses to operate daycare centers are not always easy to get. Some have been denied because the yard was deemed to be several feet too short. One center had to replace its 4 smoke detectors with a 5-detector interconnecting system at a cost of $2,000. A prospective daycare operator had to remove a wall because the door was 36 inches wide instead of 38. The women who succeeded in upgrading their homes and working their way through the red tape, 57 forms in Washington, D.C., for example, must charge more for their services to make a profit. In North Carolina, 25% of the cost of daycare is due to licensing by aggression. Some women, faced with these increased costs, can no longer afford to work outside the home. When they try to create wealth with a home business, licensing laws again hamper them. If they attempt to cut or even braid the hair of willing clients without getting several years of training to obtain a license, law enforcement agents will stop them, at gunpoint if necessary. In Chicago, hooking up a home computer to one owned by a business is illegal. In Massachusetts, no goods and services can be produced in the home for a business located elsewhere. Even in areas where home businesses are permitted, no employees may be allowed. Through my years as a landlady, I've watched my low-income tenants struggle with the aggression of licensing laws. Those who take in sewing or operate daycare in their apartments live in fear that one day the government will stop them from creating wealth without a license. What callousness to demand that others get our permission before being allowed to put food in their children's mouths or a roof over their heads. The rich get richer with our help. As in all cases of aggression, everyone loses. As we have already noted, blacks were forbidden to create wealth in their own businesses after the Civil War. Those restrictions left them vulnerable to prejudiced employers. Today, the unskilled mother is similarly discouraged by law from creating wealth through childcare or a home business. The would-be truckers and taxi drivers who cannot afford a license cannot work in their chosen profession. Licensing laws, coupled with the minimum wage laws, frequently keep the disadvantaged from ever getting a start. Infinite wealth through innumerable job possibilities is limited and made finite primarily through aggression through government. The ladder of affluence illustrates this process. If our parents are on the upper rungs of the ladder of affluence, they probably have enough wealth to put us through college or professional training so that our first job is several rungs up on the ladder. Disadvantaged individuals, however, have to start at the bottom and work their way up. Training jobs at low pay and home businesses are the first rungs of the ladder. Minimum wage and licensing laws destroy the lower rungs, giving the disadvantaged less opportunity than ever. Instead of being paid a low wage while getting training and experience, the disadvantaged must pay for training or an expensive license. Instead of having the opportunity to work their way up the ladder of affluence, they cannot get started. They are excluded from climbing the ladder at all. If they wish to survive, they must rely on the charity of others or use aggression to wrest wealth from those legally permitted to create it. How can we claim to care for the disadvantaged if we are willing to put them in this position? Those who manage to get that first job in spite of these handicaps find the marketplace ecosystem cannot effectively protect them from exploitation. For example, when licensing laws excluded blacks from the trades, these would-be entrepreneurs swelled the ranks of those seeking employment. Employers had the upper hand when the former slaves were no longer permitted to start their own businesses. By supporting aggression, we put the blacks and other disadvantaged groups at the mercy of prejudiced employers. The disadvantaged workers were sacrificed for the benefit of consumers who received no net benefit at all. As aggression is used to limit the creation of wealth by the disadvantaged and to augment the income of the advantaged, the gap between rich and poor widens. Since the disadvantaged create less wealth than they otherwise would, the society as a whole is poorer. Now we can begin to understand why the distribution of wealth is most even in countries with the highest GNP per capita, e.g., Switzerland and the United States. Countries can decrease poverty and uneven wealth distribution by abandoning the aggression that restricts the creation of wealth by the disadvantaged. Many disadvantaged Europeans immigrated to the United States because aggression through government in their homeland forbade them to create wealth for themselves and their loved ones. They wished to go where their children would not have to beg for permission to create wealth. Today, their descendants find themselves in the same trap, which they have helped to create by refusing to honor their neighbor's choice. This situation is tolerated, even encouraged, by the well-to-do in the belief that widening the gap between themselves and the disadvantaged makes them winners. People in the trades saw their incomes rise as their licensing laws forced blacks out of business after the Civil War. Licensing laws prevent ambitious, unskilled workers from offering customers a better deal than highly paid union members could. Aggression appears to serve these special interest groups well. However, this gain is largely an illusion, as the wealth pie shows. When we look closely, we see that aggression is a lose-lose proposition for everyone. The wealth pie. In the absence of aggression, everyone creates goods and services so that the wealth pie and our piece of it is as large as it can be for our current level of knowledge. As licensing laws and minimum wage laws forbid the disadvantaged from creating wealth, the pie shrinks accordingly. Our piece, the goods and services our money can buy, is proportionally diminished. Because those who lobby for and enforce these laws create no wealth themselves, the pie shrinks once again, making our piece smaller as well. As skilled workers, we may see our piece of the pie increase relative to everyone else's with these changes, but the absolute size of our piece is smaller than it otherwise would have been. We cannot buy wealth that does not exist, no matter how much money we have relative to everyone else. Even with the extra dollars, we have much less purchasing power than we would have had in the absence of aggression. The enforcement agents who keep the disadvantaged from producing wealth produce none of their own. Consequently, they must take some of ours in the form of taxes. our diminished peace shrinks further. To survive, those who are not legally permitted to create wealth demand that the law enforcement agents take some of ours, at gunpoint if necessary, as taxes to provide welfare. Our piece of the pie shrinks accordingly. Both the employed and the unemployed battle to control the force of law to gain an advantage. Each group attempts to have the guns of the law enforcement agents pointed at the other, taking turns being victims and aggressors. This is not brotherly love. This is war. The only difference between this war and the conventional ones is that both sides take turn capturing the only weapon, the government. Because each side occasionally wins, both have the illusion of gain. The cost of the weaponry of aggression, lobbying, limiting the creation of wealth, supporting those who create no wealth, is so high that both sides lose in the long run. Hostility is created and wealth is not. Other fallout occurs as well. Against the background of chronic unemployment, a belief emerges among the advantaged that some people are simply not competent enough to ensure their own survival. The disadvantaged, trapped by aggression and told that only more aggression through government can save them, begin to believe in their own impotence. While one segment of society justifies its aggressive actions on the basis of its own alleged superiority, another segment cringes with loss of self-esteem. The easy way out. In a society without minimum wage or licensing laws, disadvantaged individuals would not be excluded from creating wealth as they are today. Opportunity for on-the-job training with pay would be readily available. If employers did not give adequate pay raises to individuals who performed well, the employees would have the option of starting their own businesses, possibly competing with their former employer. In this way, the marketplace ecosystem protects a worker from exploitation. Approximately 80% of all new jobs are created by small businesses. Destroying small businesses through the aggression of licensing laws is the fastest way to destroy jobs. As small businesses are thwarted, large companies dominate. As jobs are destroyed, employers get the upper hand. As people become even poorer, dependence replaces self-sufficiency. If small businesses were not stopped at gunpoint from creating goods and services, consumers would have more options and lower prices. No one need to support enforcement agents, lobbyists, or the unemployed. Available wealth would be increased greatly and everyone's piece of the pie would be correspondingly larger. If we truly wish to narrow the gap between rich and poor, while increasing the wealth of all, the most effective thing we can do is say no to the aggression of minimum wage and licensing laws. Instead of interfering with the voluntary transactions of others, we simply honor our neighbor's choice. It's that simple. What do we do about those who would exploit or discriminate against the disadvantaged? When no physical force, fraud, or theft is involved, we simply let them reap as they sow. Employers who treat their employees poorly will lose them to the many other opportunities available when the marketplace ecosystem is free from aggression of minimum wage and licensing laws. Employees who stay with an unenlightened employer are either happy where they are or they aren't sure how to make a move. If we want to help them, we can encourage them to apply elsewhere, show them how to improve their skills, or hire them ourselves. Such actions require us to get personally involved with the disadvantaged and to truly show our concern and care. Surely, action of this type bespeaks brotherly love more than pointing guns at selfish employers. In working with the disadvantaged in this way, I have discovered that they frequently prefer a steady, safe job with low pay to the rigors of job hunting, interviewing, and the uncertainties that come with a new position. Some choose to accept low pay for jobs they are overqualified for in return for a low-stress, supportive environment. Those who really want to get ahead usually know what they need to do. A common belief in our society is that aggression can be used to rectify destructive social attitudes, such as prejudice and discrimination. Many people supported minimum wage laws because they were supposed to help, rather than hurt, the disadvantaged. As we've seen, such aggression hurts those it was intended to help. Some licensing laws were supposed to protect the consumer rather than the worker in areas where a mistake can be life-threatening, such as electrical or medical work. In the next chapter, we'll see how that aggression, as usual, harms the very people it is supposed to help.